Thank you all. Thank you all for coming today to show support for Catherine Casper, who's going to defend today a project that she's been working several years on as she's progressed through our program. So we're very proud of her. She's worked very hard on this presentation. I think you're going to find it very enjoyable, but also educational and informative. So Katie is currently the latent print forensic technical manager. That's a very long title for the Tulsa Police Department crime laboratory downstairs. She graduated with a bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology at Southwest Baptist University. And then she got a master's in forensic science from the University of Central Oklahoma. It was in her master's program, because you may be wondering, why is someone who does fingerprints talking about mass shootings? In her master's program, with her background in psychology, she became very interested in mass shooting events that targeted religious institutions. And she did her master's project on that. She continued that research into her PhD. I also do research on the motives of mass shootings, not in religious targets. So her research really aligned very closely with mine, which allowed us to really do a good project here. She's currently a PhD candidate at Oklahoma State University. She's going to be graduating, God willing. And so today she's going to be presenting to us an in-depth assessment of mass shootings directed at religious targets. If you're on Zoom, please keep yourself muted, as we will also. We're going to hold all questions till the end, and we will take questions via chat. So feel free to chat your questions now, but we won't address those until the end. Please welcome Katie Casper.
So thank you all for being here today and taking your time out to hear about my research. As Dr. Beeman said, I'm presenting to you my doctoral dissertation, an in-depth assessment of mass shootings directed at religious targets. And today I'm going to share with you the introduction of my study, kind of the importance behind it, the relevance of it, a little bit of my literature review, the methodology that I went through, the findings that I had from my research, and some conclusions or suggestions of what the findings may suggest overall to the topic. So introducing the topic, examining mass shootings under the umbrella of public mass shootings overall, it fails to acknowledge the differences in environmental characteristics and the victim's population. So for example, religious targets or religious organizations bring individuals together for spiritual growth, fellowship, ministry, worship, teachings, which makes them inherently different than any other type of just public general place where people can gather, say movie theaters, concerts, retail establishments, restaurants. Those in attendance at these other types of targets typically have a different intention for how their time is meant to be spent than they would attending, say, a religious function. And an offender's motive or typology is going to play a part in determining what type of population of victims they're wanting to target. Most typologies are going to fit into one of two overall groups based on their target, familiar versus non-familiar. Well, you can see that. Familiar offenders who target familiar targets obviously are going to be connected to the target in some way, or the population within that target, the population of individuals. A non-familiar target is going to be where the offender doesn't have any type of connection to the target itself, the location, or the victims within that establishment. And determining the motive can be difficult sometimes, especially when incidents are not consistently categorized, if they're all just generally labeled as public mass shootings. However, the specific consideration of attacks on religiously affiliated targets could provide new insight. And I was able to determine 4 typologies of offenders within the familiar and non-familiar larger umbrellas, if you will, that I wanted to study regarding my mass shooting offenders who targeted religious targets. And these definitions were from Dr. Beeman himself. The domestic violence typology of offender is going to be an individual who intends to harm victims that are co-residents, intimate partners, family members, even in-laws. In these cases, the true target is related to the offender, and sometimes victims who are injured or killed at that target can be ancillary or in the wrong place, wrong time, if they weren't connected to the offender, and that'd be under the familiar umbrella. Lone actor terrorism is going to be when an offender attacks a target as a kind of a way to achieve a desired political objective. And these individuals typically have contact or loose affiliations with some type of terror group, but not subjected to any formal training of any kind. They're just motivated by the ideals of this larger group. And then the typology of revenge is when an offender is fueled by revenge against a specific individual, particular group of individuals with certain beliefs, or even society at large, just being angry at the world. And the offender will, in these cases, sometimes believe that not only do these victims deserve what's coming to them, but it's the offender's way of gaining redemption and power for their beliefs or the revenge that they're enacting on others. And then finally, there's in commission of a crime. And this is when the offender's main motive is something other than murder there. So think maybe a robbery that goes wrong, someone enters an establishment, robbery or burglary, and the shooting that happens on scene was not really the initial intent of the offender. It's kind of it's consequences of the way the scenario plays out, if that makes sense. So mass shooting incidents are in some way a result of the offender's complicated relationship or dynamic with the world that they live in. Examining the offender's life circumstances leading up to a violent outburst may actually support specific criminological theories such as general strain theory. And general strain theory is basically the idea that several different variables in someone's life can influence or condition the effects of the strain in their life and how they might respond or engage in crime. These variables can include coping skills, different resources, social support resources, the type of people they hang around, their peers, and their just general beliefs on crime. And obviously on some level, strain is a part of nearly everybody's life. We all have different stresses and strains in our life. However, the intensity of an individual's strain is and their ability to persevere is gonna be varied. The multiple strain factors that can occur in an individual's life can manifest themselves and build up in an individual's mind and leading them to having irrational emotional states. And this irrationality and lack of control on their behavior and combined with the lack of social support can create a psychological boiling point for these offenders. So the statement of the problem of my research essentially is that religious locations are inherently different than, say, workplace, school, public locations in which mass shooters target. The targeted community of a religious organization is generally labeled as a safe space for people to gather and worship, whereas not that other public targets shouldn't be seen as safe spaces, but say, for example, movie theaters, concert venues, things like that require the purchase of a ticket and the assumption that their time will be spent being entertained or recreational. Restaurants are occupied by people intending to have a meal or people who are working there. They intend to serve their patrons. And workplace environments contain employees who are there to fulfill professional duties. Schools are an academic environment of individuals with the intent of learning and teaching. And furthermore, many of these targets have some level of regulation in how they operate. Admission is needed, purchase of a ticket is required, staff is clocking in, and religious targets are completely different in this respect in that these attendees not only share collective identity with the religious beliefs of the group they gather with, sharing these beliefs could also make them a desired target to an offender with opposing beliefs. And the fact that they open themselves up to the public, which is a wonderful thing, it can also make them vulnerable to violent individuals wanting to violate that sense of safety. And violate someone's sense of safety in that it could almost contradict what the whole premise of the location is meant to have. And this also may be enticing to offenders who really want to send a message by violating that sense of safety. So for my case selection process, this is specifically for my religiously affiliated mass shootings. I obtained data from Mother Jones, which is a nonprofit organization that has a free database of mass shooting incidents dating from 1982 to 2023. That was 9 of my cases. And I also utilized data from the Violence Project, which is also a nonprofit organization that has a free database of mass shootings dating from 1966 to 2003. Mother Jones has a minimum fatality of victims, not including the shooter, of 3, where Violence Project has a minimum fatality requirement of 4. And obviously Mother Jones and the Violence Project are going to have some duplicate information, so I cross-referenced that to make sure that I didn't have 2 cases or one case present more than once. But however, due to the strict victim definitions that these databases follow, supplemental research was necessary, which is where the other 16 cases come in. Definitions that propose minimum standards for victim or the offender can be limiting to certain research projects, because having less than 3 fatalities doesn't necessarily minimize the nature of the effect that these incidents have on our communities. And so for my part of the study, in terms of my selection of religious cases, my definition was at least 1 victim fatality and 1 injury, or at least 2 victim fatalities. So the threshold for the religious cases was a bit lower than for most mass shooting databases that we have access to. So going into my literature review, for the most part in my literature review, what I tried to do was take a study by Drs. Adam Langford and James Silver, where they studied aspects of mass shootings from 1966 to 2019. It was titled, "Why Have Public Shootings Become More Deadly?" I dissected that article overall, and then they proposed 5 reasons, I'll get to that, as to why they think mass shootings are becoming more deadly, but within each reason I supplement with other extra literature review research. Dr. Langford and Silver, they examined 165 mass shooting cases with the goal of determining if mass shootings have become more deadly, why have they become more deadly? If they determine that they have, then let's see why. They proposed 5 possible explanations as to why these offenses are becoming more deadly, and they are an increased desire for fame and attention, the influence of previous attackers, an increased desire to kill large numbers of people, the easier accessibility of semi-automatic rifles and assault weapons, and offenders having extended planning periods. Furthermore, they also separated shootings out by decade to compare the victim count. And within each decade, shootings that had 8 or more fatalities were labeled as high fatality incidents. And they found that the decade of just 2010 to 2019 contained 53% of all total victims, even going all the way back to 1966. And then they further narrowed those requirements to incidents that had 12 or more fatalities, and then even further narrowed it to 16 or more fatalities in that decade of 2010 to 2019 was still the leader in each of those categories. So that first suggestion that they have for why mass shootings are becoming deadlier, increased desire for fame and attention. So I mentioned earlier what qualifies a high fatality incident. I'm just going to keep it at 8 or more rather than going so narrow as 16. High fatality incidents where the offender exhibited circumstantial evidence of fame seeking was present in 44% of cases between 1966 to 2009, but that shot up to 78% of cases between 2010 and 2019. And circumstantial evidence refers to if the attacker has engaged in attention-seeking behavior, it's believed they want to bring attention to an ideological cause, or they were just believed to be seeking fame or attention by somebody intimately familiar with the case. Furthermore, high fatality incidents where the offender exhibited explicit evidence of fame seeking was only present in 25% of the cases between 1966 to 2009, whereas it was present in 56% of the cases between 2010 and 2019. And they describe explicit evidence as the offender openly admitting to seeking fame or attention, having direct contact with the media to get attention, making public statements before or even during the attack that are obviously intended for a wider audience. And these results here reveal a steady increase in fame-seeking offenders as the decades pass on. So looking at a suggestion of the influence of previous attackers, many offenders are obviously going to be watching the news, being possibly influenced by media, news stories, all different types of internet sources. High fatality incidents, which remember is 8 or more, in which the offender was known to have directly cited, referenced, or studied a previous mass public killer, was present in 25% of cases between 1966 to 2009, and that shot up to 50% of cases between 2010 and 2019. And furthermore, these cases in which they had known inspiration or influence of a previous attacker, these were 48% more deadly. For example, in the years following the Columbine high school mass shooting, many offenders looked at Eric Harris as a role model and saw what him and Dylan Klebold did as an admirable act, which validates them to go further and commit attacks themselves. And the influence of previous high-profile mass shooters, it not only has the potential to spark inspiration among these offenders, it also creates the sense of competition among offenders. For example, competition between violent offenders can exist in sometimes the form of body count goals. Within this culture, the higher the body count of the victims, the more they may gain respect and admiration within this culture of individuals. Dylan Roof, who was the Charleston, South Carolina church shooter from Mother Emanuel, he was quoted in saying he wants to kill a bunch of people in days leading up to the attack. And Chris Harper Mercer was quoted in saying that, hey, the more people you kill, the more you're in the limelight. So these are statements that seem like, hey, the more I kill, the more I'm going to be famous in this community, or I'm going to gain respect among this set of peers, if you want to call them that. And then furthermore, combining these factors with an increased desire for fame, like we mentioned before, and it can potentially galvanize an offender to motivate them during their planning stages of the attack as well. So this actually, I made this graph based on data from Langford and Silver. I just wanted a nice visual representation, but they proposed that the easier accessibility of semi-automatic rifles and weapons contributes to the increased deadliness of mass shootings. They found that from 1966 to 2009, high fatality mass shootings involving a semi-automatic rifle made up about 31% of cases, but from 2010 to 2019, that increased to about 56% of cases. Also, incidents where the offenders use extensively lethal weapons such as that resulted in a higher fatality count than offenders who chose not to use those type of weapons. Also, high fatality public mass shootings where they used multiple firearms slightly decreased during this time, just from 81% to 78%. It wasn't anything too drastic. But interestingly enough, between the years of 2000 and 2015, the number of semi-automatic weapon manufacturers increased from 29 manufacturers to 500, which is a 1,700% increase in manufacturing. But it should be noted that even though the manufacturing dramatically increased, the consumer demand wasn't quite on the same pace. So that will then turn the weapons to becoming less expensive because the demand isn't quite there. They have so much to choose from and not that much demand. Let's lower the prices to sell more. And then furthermore, when the semi-automatic weapons are more easily available, that's even less reasons not to own one, so they can get in the wrong hands. So going on to extended planning periods as a reason, the measurement of planning period, was based on the first point in which they were known to have expressed any interest in committing a mass killing or have taken a specific step to prepare for the attack. So high fatality incidents where the offender planned their attack for at least a year was present in 38% of cases between 1966 and 2009, and that went up to 50% of cases between 2010 and 2019. And also these cases resulted in 85% more victims than cases that appeared to have shorter planning periods. Not only do these extensive planning periods give the offender more time to plan their actions, obviously, it provides the offender time to prepare for some defensive scenarios, maybe plan an escape strategy. For example, 24-year-old Matthew Murray up on your screen, he hit 2 locations during his attack on December 9th, 2007. He started at Faith Bible Church in Arvada, Colorado, before fleeing and further attacking New Life Church in Colorado Springs. Over the span of his attacks on these 2 targets, he killed 4 and wounded 4, and then ultimately took his own life. But during the investigation, it was found that he was carrying not only an assault rifle, but 2 handguns of over 1,000 rounds of ammunition in his backpack and another assault rifle waiting in his car. During the search of his home, it was found that investigators recovered another handgun, several internet downloads containing information on mass shootings, along with books on homicides, tactical shooting survival. And then when they traced the purchasing records of his firearms, the first purchase was made in November of 2006, indicating that he was planning his attack for more than a year leading up to the shooting. So moving on to my research, my methodology. So I followed what's called an exploratory sequential mixed method design, and that goes in 3 phases. So first there is qualitative data collection, and I'll go into each one of these steps. Building a feature to be tested, and quantitative testing of the feature. So this 3-step design was selected to quantitatively try to measure the kind of conceptual idea of mass shooting incidents and the offender typologies. So the first stages of my qualitative data collection were much like using Mother Jones and Violence Project in my supplemental research for my religious cases. I had to have something to compare it to. So I also utilized those databases for shootings that occurred at educational targets and public targets. I wanted to see if there were any differences based on the offender's target selection. The cases, like I said, were from Mother Jones Violence Project and my supplemental research. Obviously there was crossover and some duplication, so I went through them all and made sure I didn't have one case in there multiple times, because I pulled from two databases that kind of had some overlapping requirements. Religious targets for this more specific part of my study could include anything from obviously a church, mosque, synagogue, ministry training center, temple, church events, any type of gathering of individuals for religious purposes. And like I mentioned earlier, the minimum fatality criteria for the religious sample was 1 fatality and 1 injury or 2 fatalities. This criteria for the victim count criteria was not applied to educational or public mass shootings because there is no database out there with such strict victim criteria as I wanted for my design. Oh, I scrolled in the wrong box. Sorry. Okay. So like I was saying, the narrow victim criteria is just not present in any other public database that's available out there. And so also applying this lowered fatality and injury minimum to religious targets, it was also necessary when studying the specific phenomenon of religious mass shootings. And it also allowed for the inclusion of 13 cases that wouldn't have met the victim requirements of Mother Jones or the Violence Project. So I was able to look at far more incidents in depth than if I had increased that victim count. So what did I collect for the qualitative data collection on all of these cases? Oh, I should have showed back there, 220 cases total. Okay, so I looked at things like the offender age, sex, marital status, very straightforward things like that. If they had a job, if they had a known diagnosed mental illness prior to the attack. That doesn't mean they were evaluated by mental health experts after the shooting and then were diagnosed later. It has to be a diagnosis of a mental illness prior to engaging in the attack. If they had any criminal history, connection to the target, the presence of a clear motive, warning signs, things like that, and state, demographic information. I collected this type of information for 2 main reasons. This was the type of information most consistently available among the databases I used and the information that I was reading about all these cases. And all of these factors were valuable in determining an offender's motive, as well as any significant kind of demographic findings among these groups. And then specifically for religious mass shootings, I looked at those 4 typologies that I selected the 4 typologies that I mentioned before, and these types of typologies were only applied to this mass shooting sample. And speaking of those typologies, step 2 of my design was building a feature to be tested, and this is where I created a synopsis for each of the 30 mass shooting cases that I had, and I recruited 5 raters from the Tulsa Police Department. We had 3 former homicide detectives who have now retired into civilian positions, 1 former homicide detective who's been promoted to lieutenant recently, and then 1 current homicide detective. These raters, if you will, they were given these 30 synopses, and then were asked to grade on a Likert scale from 1 to 5 of how much each synopsis fits within each typology. 1 being not related at all, 5 being highly related. And then even beyond just measuring which typology measurement goes with each offender, they were then just asked to provide a final conclusion of which typology they believe fit that offender best. And then the importance of that is we're trying to determine what's called inter-rater reliability. And inter-rater reliability essentially exists when the classification of a set of objects by raters is the same, especially raters that are apparently experts in violent crime. This is their whole career. And inter-rater reliability was not tested for educational or public mass shootings because as my research methodology went on, we're narrowing it down further to just religious. So the quantitative testing to see if there are any significant differences between the different targets, which I'll go into my research questions next. For the most part, I utilized the IBM SPSS statistical program. I ran one-way analysis of variance, chi-square tests of independence. And for that inter-rater reliability measurement I mentioned earlier, I used a program called AgreeStat 360 to generate what's called a WETS AC1 coefficient, which it gives you a coefficient that shows you the strength of agreement between my 5 raters. So my research questions. Are there any statistically significant interactions among variables surrounding mass shooting incidents occurring at religious targets, educational targets, and/or public targets? What's the level of agreement between my raters? What are the characteristics for each typology of offenders who choose religious targets? And even narrowing it down even further, are there any statistically significant interactions among variables surrounding religious mass shootings between the 4 typology types that we determined with the raters? Another thing I meant to mention with the raters is that I had 5 raters, and so the final determination of typology for each case was based on the majority rater vote. So say if 3 raters said it was revenge, but 2 said lone actor terrorism, we went with majority rater vote on each of those cases. So they made the final determination of typology. So going to my findings, and I know I just went over my research questions, but research question 1, if you want a refresher, is up there. I found that on average, shootings that occurred at educational targets resulted in significantly more fatalities. A finding is significant when the p-value is less than 0.05, and I have it up there so you can see is 0.009. And the average fatalities for educational targets was 9.63. Furthermore, while it's not statistically significant, I thought it was worth noting that the average number of injuries for educational shootings was also the highest. So there's a little bit of a trend there. On average, offenders who selected the educational targets were significantly younger, and on the flip of that, the ones who targeted religious targets were significantly older, as you can see. Some examples of what may have contributed to these high averages and low averages. So for the educational shooting category, we have the offenders Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson, who were 11 and 13 years old respectively, and they targeted West Side Middle School in Arkansas in 1998. So just a little bit of a visual of what could contribute to these significantly different means. And then 4 of these offenders are within my religious shooting sample, and they're all 70 years old or above. We have Robert Lloyd Jeffress, Robert Finley Smith, Larry Jean Ashbrook, and Sergei Beberin. And this can kind of show where these extreme ends what can contribute to these extreme ends. And then moving on to my chi-square test of independence, which the ANOVA measures differences in means. The chi-square test of independence just measures the relationship between 2 different variables. So for example, target type and diagnosis of mental illness. What's the strength of relationship there? And I found that there was a significant relationship between target type and diagnosis of mental illness, and it has the same requirement as the one-way ANOVA. A p-value of less than 0.05 makes it significant. It was found that offenders who targeted religious and public targets were less likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness, while offenders who targeted educational targets were far more likely to have been diagnosed. And then on the upper part where I start talking about Kramer's V, Kramer's V is essentially a measure of effect size, which is just a fancy way of saying what's the strength of agreement. So it was found that although the relationship between target type and diagnosis of mental illness was significant, it was weak on the evaluation scale. And I only have that scale up 1 time for you. It doesn't need to be on every slide, but I will say what the Kramer's V number means on each relationship. There was also a significant relationship between target type and the offender's connection to the target. Offenders who targeted religious and educational targets were far more likely to have a prior connection to the target, while offenders who targeted public targets were less likely to have a previous connection with that target. And the effect size here, Kramer's V, is 0.287, which means it is significant and it's a moderate relationship. There was also a significant relationship between target type and the offender's employment status, with offenders who selected religious and educational targets being less likely to be employed. And with the Kramer's V effect size of 1.180, the relationship is significant yet weak. Furthermore, target type and offender's marital status had a significant relationship. Overall, all offenders were less likely to be married than they were to be unmarried. It just really wasn't something that was, very, very much common within these groups of offenders. But even though it was still a significant relationship in that the religious offenders were more likely to be married than the other groups. And the effect size is 0.180, which means it is a significant but weak relationship between variables. There's also a significant relationship between target type and the offender being killed on scene. And this can be as a result of officers sworn or even civilian actions on scene, someone stepping in during the act. It was found that offenders were just not likely to be killed during the course of the events. It really wasn't something that happened quite commonly, but religious offenders were the least likely to be killed out of all the 3 target types. The effect size was 0.165, which once again means the relationship is significant but weak. My last two findings from research question 1 were that there was a significant relationship between target type and the offender's criminal history. It was found that nearly half of all religious mass shooting offenders had a prior criminal history, while the majority of educational shooting offenders did not have a prior criminal history. The effect size 0.171, which means that it is a significant relationship, but it is weak. And then finally, there was a significant relationship between the target type and the offender's warning signs. Offenders who selected educational targets, were far more likely to be exhibiting warning signs. And this is a significant and moderate relationship between variables. So with all those findings from research question 1, we can reject the null hypothesis that there are no statistically significant interactions among variables, because we did find some. So moving on to research question number 2. This is just an example of this is all the data from my raters and their their conclusions of typology determination. Offender typology determinations for the religious cases were, like I said, selected on a majority rater vote. You can see here, for the most part, we had where there was an easy majority vote, if not all of them voting the exact same typology for that specific offender. So what did I find from the strength of agreement between my raters? My AC1 coefficient was 0.65. So what does this mean? This means that there's a moderate level of agreement between raters. Okay. This is there's more than one benchmark. There's more than one benchmark scale to measure the coefficient. Gwet himself suggests finding a benchmark scale that is the most specific, or at least as specific as you'd like it to be for your data. I picked a very specific benchmark scale, and it was called the Landis and Koch Kappa benchmark scale. And inter-rater reliability was valuable for this project because it determined if the typology determinations that my raters made were reliable enough to be considered when investigating these incidents moving forward. And with the coefficient of 0.564, that is a moderate level of agreement. And for research question number 2, we failed to reject the null hypothesis that there are not, we wanted it to be, obviously, you always want it to be substantial or perfect agreement, but there was not that high level of agreement, so it was moderate, so we failed to reject the null. And so I will say, we still went forward and wanted to find characteristics of these different offenders who choose different typologies. So it is important to emphasize that these results are meant to be taken with caution because the rater agreement level was moderate. We still wanted to go ahead, me, myself, and I, still wanted to go ahead, I always say we, wanted to go ahead and see if there were any, notable specific statistics or findings between these groups that may have made them more specific to each typology category. So before I get into these, there were no cases that were finally assigned to the commission of a crime typology. So from now on, when I'm talking about the typologies, it will just be revenge, domestic violence, and lone actor terrorism. So I found that in the revenge typology, it was 7 of the 30 cases, and 42.9% occurred in Texas. The average age of the offender was 39.71. All of the offenders in this category were men, and 85.7% were Caucasian. The majority did not have a diagnosed mental illness, and they did not have a previous connection to the target. Oh, excuse me, they did. The majority did have a previous connection to their target, and a majority of them had evidence of a clear motive. 71.4% of these revenge offenders died by suicide, and over half of them exhibited warning signs. In total, offenders in the revenge typology caused the deaths of 47 individuals and injured 49 between 1966 and 2023. So offenders who were assigned to the domestic violence typology, that made up 9 of my 30 cases, where 55.6% were married. The average age was 33.44. 88.9% were men, and majority race was African American at 44.4%. Over half of these offenders did not have a diagnosed mental illness, but 100% of these offenders that were domestic violence typology did have a connection to their target. And majority, 77.8%, had evidence of a clear motive as well. Over half had a previous criminal history, but only one of the offenders exhibited warning signs, and that was Anthony Bell. He targeted the Ministry of Jesus Christ in Louisiana, and I'll talk about him a little bit more in a few slides. But in total, the domestic violence offenders caused the deaths of 25 individuals and the injuries of 14 between those same dates. And finally, for the lone actor terrorism typology, this made up the majority of my offenders at 14 of my 30 offenders. Only 14.3% were married. The average age, excuse me, was a little bit higher than the other two typologies at 45.14. 100% of these offenders were men. A majority were Caucasian. Only 3 of my 14 offenders had a diagnosed mental illness, and 78.6 did not have a previous connection to the target. And evidence of a clear motive was present in just a little over half of these cases. Only 35.7 had a previous criminal history, but over half exhibited some warning signs. And in total, the lone actor terrorist offenders caused the deaths of 57 individuals and injured 44 between 1966 and 2023. So looking at my final research question to see if there's any statistically significant interactions between variables between these categories. And I know I have commission of a crime up there, but like I said, nothing was determined to be in commission of a crime, so that isn't reported here. It was found that on average, the injuries caused by offenders within the revenge typology category were significantly higher. You can see an average injury of 7 individuals, whereas for the other typologies, it was quite lower. And while not statistically significant, the average number of fatalities for the revenge typology was also the highest. So it was not significantly higher than the other two typologies, but it was still the highest out of the 3. And I found a significant interaction between the typology and if they had a connection to that target. Offenders within the revenge and the domestic violence typologies were more likely to have a connection to their target, while offenders within the lone actor terrorism typology were far less likely to have a connection to their target. And the effect size for this relationship was 0.744, which means not only is it a significant relationship, but it's also a strong relationship between variables. So for research question number 4, we reject the null hypothesis that offenders who are selecting religious targets were not going to have any significant interactions because we found some significant interactions between variables. So I shared my key findings, or excuse me, my findings of my statistical analysis, but let's kind of try to interpret them here. So some key findings I'd like to discuss in research question number 1 was that educational offenders had the highest fatalities and injuries. They were also more likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness, more likely to exhibit warning signs, and least likely to have a criminal record. Okay, so why is this so consistent among these categories? Why are they sticking out? So the highest fatality and injury counts could be explained by densely populated classrooms in both schools and colleges. I know this room has 2 entrances and exits, but a traditional classroom only has 1, so it may be more difficult to find an escape route. And active shooter training or lack thereof on any type of campus can obviously play a huge role on how the victim count plays out on a mass shooting in these types of educational targets. For the second and third key finding, since these offenders were significantly younger, we saw that like several slides ago. Since these offenders are typically school or college age, they may actually be spending most of their days in close proximity to other classmates, teachers, roommates, parents, family members, who would be more likely to observe these warning signs in the offenders. Even if they're intentionally showing these signs or not, they can be observed by more people. Individuals at a younger age, like a teenager, is going to be less likely to isolate completely from people in society because they might be enrolled in school and be living at home with their family. Also, observation of these warning signs may also lead to a higher likelihood of being diagnosed with a mental illness when it's spotted at a younger age. And this is unlike older offenders who may live alone and have less opportunity to be their strange behavior to be observed or have leakage about their events that they want to take out on. And the very last one, it could be simply explained by offenders who target these types of incidents are just younger offenders, which gives them less lifespan to have created a criminal history. So that's just kind of a simple explanation. When I found that both educational and religious offenders were more likely to have a previous connection to the target, this could be because both educational and religious institutions kind of represent their own set of values and ideals, which may lead to offenders having experienced these environments for themselves and not agreeing with how those places were operating. And they also may have been affected by how these two different types of establishments, educational and religious establishments, they judge their attendees in some form or the other, if that makes sense. Say, for example, poor performance or inappropriate behavior in a classroom would lead to negative consequences, detention, expulsion, things like that, suspension. And illicit behavior or an alternative or unaccepted lifestyle within the church could lead to judgment from the congregants, religious leaders, or just not telling them they don't think they belong within that community. Across all the target types, it was found that they were more likely to be unemployed and more likely to be unmarried. And this may be explained by the fact that offenders would have more free time on their hands if they were not to have a job to take up their day. And furthermore, all offenders are also more likely to be unmarried, and this can be explained by a variety of factors. If someone has poor social skills and violent tendencies, it may be harder for them to keep a partner within their life. Living with a spouse may also present obstacles when planning a mass shooting. Spouses may find hidden weapons or plans, may attempt to stop the offender from committing the attack, or even alert the authorities if they become strongly suspicious. So some of these offenders may say, I don't even want to deal with someone living in my house. I want to have all free time and I don't want anyone's opinion. I'm doing this, I'm planning it. So lone actor terrorism was the most frequent typology assignment among all 5 of my raters, with 14 of my 30 cases. All 5 of my raters agreed that Dylan Roof was a lone actor terrorist. He was a Caucasian male. He was no connection to the target. He just joined on a Wednesday night Bible study at African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was unmarried, unemployed, and clearly openly motivated by racist and white supremacist beliefs. He wasn't even recognized by anyone in attendance. He was not even familiar with the area. This makes him sort of a prototype lone actor terrorist example of an offender. My next most frequent typology was domestic violence, with I think it was 9 of my offenders. Before abducting his wife, Erica, and their 3 children, Anthony Bell shot Erica's mother, killed her grandparents, her great aunt, and her cousin, fled the scene with his wife, Erica, and the children. And when he was eventually located by police at a nearby apartment complex, he shot and killed Erica. He did not take his own life, but he had a history of domestic violence against Erica, causing her to request a restraining order against him. And she also shared in the petition for a restraining order that he had beat her several times and given her a black eye. He was essentially the prototypical domestic violence example, African-American male whose wife attended the church, a history of domestic violence against his wife, and he killed his wife and several of her family members during the attack. So this is a visual representation of all the different religions that were present within these attacks. Religious determinations, I will say, were based on the straightforward naming of the establishment, and this was done to reduce any type of maybe misinterpretation or assumption based on the, on the part of the primary investigator. I just didn't want to assume something, say a certain religion was connected to a certain denomination. So that being said, combining religions to fit under their overarching denomination could obviously impact results. So let's say Baptist, Catholic, Episcopal, they're all basically under the Christian umbrella, but the unique belief systems that cause them to be designated with a more specific name are why I chose to leave them under that specific name of religion. So looking at the revenge motivated offenders and some of the findings from that, it was found that 71% of the offenders died by suicide, and this is consistent in other mass shooting research on these types of offenders. Dr. James Knoll explained that these offenders are expecting not only to kill, but also to be killed, sometimes by their own hand, since there's no escape planned. It may even force police to kill him. And this can suggest that they see the attack as the end all be all of their life and their final way to gain that sense of redemption and power. For domestic violence motivated offenders, it was found that religious mass shooting cases were found to be motivated by 30%, were found to be motivated by domestic violence, but they had the lowest of the average fatalities. Nearly all of the domestic violence motivated offenders were seeking violence toward their significant other. And over half of these offenders were married, and all of the married offenders killed their spouse during the course of the attack. This actually may give insight into the idea that the offender's religious target doesn't necessarily mean that it's an attack on that specific religion, where for like contrasting, lone actor terrorists might just go out and I'm gonna shoot as many people as I can, where a domestic violence offender is like, well, I wanna shoot my spouse, her mother, and her cousin. And that would then make a lesser victim fatality count than someone motivated a different way. They're not focused on killing as many people as possible. They're more narrowly focused. And like I was saying, it can kind of give an assumption that though I am obviously studying religious mass shootings, sometimes the religion itself isn't the reason why that place is targeted. And so why no commission of another crime offenders? Why did none of my raters pick that typology? And this could be because these offenders are not, these environments are not typically known for having a lot of expensive goods, and robbery and burglary can be less likely to occur. I mean, I've heard of churches being burglarized, but typically it's late at night to steal, say, the worship equipment or something like that. With these happening more likely at night when no one is in the building, there's obviously a far more reduced number of potential victims because nobody's in the building. So finally, for the lone actor terrorist motivated offenders, like I was saying, most of them did not have a previous connection to their target, and most did not have a diagnosed mental illness, and they were unmarried, and they were least likely to have a criminal history. So why all these characteristics? This may be explained by the offender's desire to send an overall statement by targeting an entire group of people rather than someone who's connected to him or her. The isolation that they have for being unmarried or unemployed could reduce the situations in which they would be out doing illegal things and getting arrested, or even then getting diagnosed with a mental illness. And like I said, the lack of social skills and maybe interpersonal relationships would attribute to that unmarried status, like I mentioned earlier. And this isolation and not being in a relationship could explain how these offenders are able to acquire these weapons, execute attacks in a larger scale, because they can devote time to focus on their violent goal and more thoroughly plan the attacks. So an interesting finding was, even though revenge had the highest fatality and injury averages, lone actor terrorism had the highest fatality and injury totals. And like lone actor terrorism were least likely to have a connection to the target. I know I kind of mentioned that in the last slide. I just wanted to emphasize it because we're moving on to the final research question. Even though there were a few lone actor terrorists that had a very high fatality count, and while that is contributing to the high total, it was not enough to surpass the average victim fatality count for revenge category, if that makes sense. So the few lone actor terrorist cases that had high fatalities did not qualify it to be still the highest on average. Hope that makes sense. And then let's see. So those are essentially some suggestions I could make from my findings. Some of my limitations could be my sample size. Although mass shootings occur infrequently, mass shootings directed at religious targets occur even less frequently. This limitation is unavoidable. I mean, I obviously don't want these incidents happening like crazy, but I'm setting what I can and what's there. Whether by suicide or force, sometimes there's a lack of information because of the offender's death. Conversations that they may have with the offender after the incident, they produce valuable information as to the why, answering the why questions, but if the offender is deceased, sometimes it's just going to be a why forever. Also, if the offender is just not cooperating, that happens a lot during the investigation. Also, the typology definitions, they could have maybe been more narrow, and that maybe could have cleared things up for my raters as well, just sharpening them a little bit more specific on the domestic violence typology, things like that, but that's just a possibility. So my recommendations for future research was, I think it would be really interesting to study the deadliness of weapons versus fatality and injury count for each typology. I really wanted to put what weapons were used for each shooting, but that data was just not readily available consistently for all cases. And I didn't want to study something that had massive gaps throughout. Looking at an offender's in-depth history with religion compared to the religion they're targeted in like a case study form would be really interesting. Are they targeting the religion that they grew up in because they were made to be resentful of it? Or are they targeting something completely opposite of what they grew up believing because they're so strong in their beliefs they don't believe people should think anything different? It'd be interesting to study the effectiveness of active shooter training and domestic violence training in religious establishments, like a longevity study over time to see if these trainings make a difference in the sense of safety. And it would have been really nice to do an inter-rater reliability study across the typology of all offenders, all target types, all 220 cases. So maybe someday I can do that as well. So just some ideas for future. So, do you have any questions?
All right, thank you. That was absolutely perfect.
Thank you.
Any presentation, any questions from people in the audience or anyone on Zoom? If you're on Zoom, if you would please chat in your questions.
You have one fire. You're looking at me. Yeah.
I've got 3 questions.
Of course you do,
yeah. I guess the first question that I have is, did I understand correctly that you developed a scale that was then used for the inter-rater reliability testing?
Oh, it was just a Likert. You mean the measurement of 1 to 5? Or what do you
Yeah,
mean?
like the questionnaire that
I made
call
that.
it a scale that you provided. I'm curious if you think that scale could be useful for future investigations, like as far as determining motivations.
Oh yeah, for all different types of crimes even. I think,
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
robbery or sexual assault, things like that, that could be interesting as well.
Okay, cool, yeah. I didn't hear you speak more on that part of it,
Yeah.
so I was curious if
Yeah.
you thought that could still be out
Oh
there.
yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe the typology choices might be a little different based on the crime. I can't speak to saying that the 4 that I had my raters use would apply to all different types of crimes, but
Yeah.
that structure of the scale could surely be useful for other things, yeah.
I may have missed this part on it, but I was curious if you could, what method or methods did you use in the qualitative phase of your exploratory sequential design? I just didn't see.
Yeah, no, you're good. I use Mother Jones database and Violence Project, and then also they have a database as well, and then also my own supplemental research, and that really only applied to the religious shooting group because my victim requirements were less than the other databases. So the other databases only had I want to say like 17 of the cases that I use. So I had to do my own supplemental research for the mass shootings in the religious category that fit my definition that weren't even present.
So just to follow up on that, were you looking just at numeric characteristics in databases, or were there were there case studies that you,
Yes.
like in the case studies you were actually able to read and then obtain, like, if you will, the words or the.
Yeah, so these databases were very extensive. I mean, they had if the offender was diagnosed mentally ill, even as far as where they were in the birth order of their siblings. I mean, it was insanely extensive, and they had case summaries and all the references to support all of this information. I mean, from how they got their weapons, legally or illegally, what weapons, but that, like I said, that wasn't consistent among all cases. They were very extensive databases. So, and I was able to get quite a bit from those 2, and then had to do my own supplemental for my other ones.
Can I ask a question between your second?
Yeah.
2A and B and
Yep,
3?
you got it.
When I see stats on mass shootings, like I'm seeing gangbangers, and I think you answered the question because I was curious how Mother Jones has all kinds of mass shootings that aren't what I would consider anything related to your study. So did you go in with a religious lens and educational lens? Because there's been shootings at school that are gang related that I wouldn't expect to see in your study.
That's a good
So
question.
how did you do that?
So actually, I didn't mention this in the presentation, but the way I did my case selection, and these databases also, they determined, like, they had an area for what target they think it falls under, religious, educational, whatever. I went in and evaluated those, but I wanted to say, I meant to mention it, that I didn't include solely domestic shootings that only occurred in the home, and I did not include shootings that happened on like a secure military base, because those wouldn't fall under public. I know you asked about religious, but I would go in and evaluate the it's just the target itself.
So like Fort Hood, you didn't consider?
Because it's the access, because some databases put that under public mass shooting, but that's not a target that's really available to the public. It's only certain people have access to that area. So I was trying to be a little bit more consistent among my public definition. And
So is religiosity related to the target or the offender?
the target. So just the physical target of it.
If it was a synagogue or a mosque or like a
I even had like a Mormon library that was targeted and an Amish schoolhouse, which was one of my cases that was like, okay, where does this fall? But the offender openly admitted that they were angry at God, which is why I chose that as a religious shooting, if that makes sense. I had to go into each case and kind of make sure I just wasn't taking blindly what somebody else is calling something.
Right, and I think it's really, I think that's great, and that makes sense for where you select the cases from, and I think it's important to list all those things
Mhm.
as you're in your methodology, because it's gonna, you're not trying to bias it, you're trying to be fair. You're
Yes.
saying like, hey, well, you don't think military bases are accessible, so you're not gonna include those. Okay,
Yeah,
as long as you're upfront with that, I think
Yeah.
it's great, because I think you still develop something that's probably a useful tool in multiple scenarios.
I have all that in the dissertation. I'm a talker, so I had to trim
No,
quite a bit out of
you-
it. You guys are here for 2 hours.
Yeah, we don't see the whole thing, so, but
Yeah.
that was my question, 'cause
Yeah.
I was just curious, because I see like these stats, and I'm like, have there been 300 shootings this year? I don't remember, anyway,
Yeah.
so, but yours make more sense.
You know, I
to
know
me.
what you mean. I've seen somewhere it's like there have been 300 mass shootings. Okay, what's your criteria for this? So, no, that's a good question.
I do wanna, we have some online questions. Byron, did you have another?
Yeah, I got just a softball. Did you think that general strain theory offered a good explanation for a lot of the factors that were involved in these mass shootings? Or were there other social theories that you thought that might be a better fit?
I mean, ever since I took Dr. Bullard's class on applied forensic theory, I kind of latched onto that, but while I was in the class, I applied all the criminological theories she offered us to my study as we were meant to do. I feel like strain theory was the more appropriate for this specific type of phenomenon when I studied all the other ones. And every case is different because there could have been, we learned all about criminological theories that support what happens just in the home between like child development and things like that. But like I was saying with the firearms information, some stuff just is not readily available enough to me to start making assumptions about things, if that makes sense. So I was just, in a lot of other studies I read, they lean to general strain theory as well. I thought it was really interesting.
Awesome, thanks.
Have you looked at any of the more recent religious shootings to see if the correlations are applicable?
Like say the Joel Osteen Church, possibly. So I have, but I could not include them because I already got all my synopses written and given to my readers, and I didn't want to interrupt their process. So I haven't studied them in depth quite yet because I like to let some time pass before I dive into these cases, because if you jump right in right away, just all of the information typically isn't there. So I like to wait until the agency does their investigative summary and kind of read what their findings are. I like to take some time before I dive in. So.
That was a female too, that was
Mhm.
probably her only.
I know, yeah.
Dr. Brown says, excellent presentation, future Dr. Casper. In regards to religious targets, it appeared that the targets analyzed were of Judeo-Christian background. Were there any extrapolations in terms of other religious groups, such as Muslim, Islam, or Hindu, etc.?
Actually, we did have some of those. Let me go back to that slide just so, so not widely represented, but say for example, I had only one case that was a Sikh temple. I had 10% were Jewish establishments, but there really wasn't much deviation from the Judeo-Christian like you were mentioning. So this is a little bit, I hope they can see it online, but not a whole lot of deviation from that, honestly.
Is Pittsburgh in that?
Yes, Pittsburgh is in it. Yes. Any other questions?
There's one in Jersey City that was a husband and wife team.
Mhm. Yeah, that was one of my few female offenders, because it's just so rare, and that was in a team, which is interesting too. That's kind of rare as well. Thanks, ma'am.
Great presentation, thank you so much. And this is maybe ancillary to like what you actually studied, but just coming from someone who's 35 now. When I was growing up, we never did active shooter drills in school, but I think school shootings began as you and I were coming up. So did you notice at all any change between fatalities between, when we were in school all the way up to present day where they're having regular active shooter drills?
Yeah, so actually that's interesting. And in my dissertation, I kind of discussed a little bit that our age group also makes up the primary group of offenders, the millennials. Yeah, so it seems as if we were in school back then, and for some reason, they weren't as common, but as we are leaving the school age and aging out, a lot of people around our age are the offenders, which has caused a trend now in these active shooter drills being an actual thing, and metal detectors when you walk in. I didn't really see anything specifically on, well, I mean, they were becoming obviously more fatal between 2010 and 2019, absolutely significantly more fatal. But I don't really know if, I'd love to see like active shooter drill, like I said specifically for, it'd be really interesting to see the longevity study of the benefits of an active shooter plan at a church. But that could apply to all different types of targets, so no, but that's a really good idea.
Okay, so you had said that it's starting to see now like longer planning periods. Is that, you might have said, but is that just because like the internet and more easily accessible information, or is there something else that?
I think like, there's no definitive answer for that, but I would say the data suggests that certainly.
Okay.
I think it's kind of a combination. I'm idolizing a mass shooter by reading all about him on the internet. I can buy all these weapons on the internet, and I can look at the schedules of these, say, these churches or whatever target you're targeting, but that makes really good sense. So yeah, it's a good point.
All right, I think that brings us to the end. Please give Dr. Casper a round of applause. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we will go ahead and conclude here. Could I get her committee to stay by? Thank you all for coming so much.